Okay. I hope you're all well fed and rested. My name is Pascale Massot. I'll be moderating this panel, the first panel of the afternoon. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Ottawa, focusing on political economy of China, natural resources, Canada-China relations. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel on Taiwan shared resiliency, fostering trade and securing supply chains. Thank you so much to Bijan and the IPD team for organizing this. And it's nice to see so many friendly faces in the room. So we have four distinguished panelists with us today. So the format will be a discussion structured around questions, so there will be no opening statements. I'll lead with a broad question, but before I do so, I'm sure you have the bios with you, but I'll give just a very brief introduction of each of the panelists, so you have an idea. So to my immediate left is Hugh Steffens, currently Stevens. ESL, you know, PH and V's for me are just a mystery. So Vice Chair of the Canadian Committee on Pacific Economic Cooperation and Distinguished Fellow at the APFC. In his 30-plus year career as a diplomat, he was posted as a Canadian representative in Taiwan, which I thought was pretty relevant to today, alongside other postings in Seoul, Islamabad, and Beijing. Immediately thereafter, to my left is Bonnie Glick, who is an American diplomat and businesswoman who served as the Deputy Administrator, COO of the United States Agency for International Development until very recently, 2019 to 2020. She also served for 12 years as a Foreign Service officer at the U.S. Department of State, and then worked at IBM for some years. And then moving forward to the left is Carlo Dade, Director of the Trade and Investment Center, Canada West Foundation. He has a reputation for developing creative solutions to some of the major challenges facing Canadian exporters and defending Canadian interests in trade with China and the US. Frequent media commentator, he's a global expert on Pan-Pacific trade, including the CPTPP and other trade blocs in the region. And then finally, we have Meredith Lilly, and she's an associate professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and holds the Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy. She previously served as Foreign Affairs and International Trade Advisor to Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, where she oversaw Canada's free trade negotiations with South Korea and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's an interesting kind of link between us on this because I actually worked on the CPTPP file when I was advisor to Minister Champagne when he was trade minister. And I'm saying this just because I think it's notable that Canada was able to push through a deal like this that was initiated under a conservative government and then signed and ratified under a Liberal government. And, you know, the deal in question hit very major roadblocks in the United States, you know, after changes of government. So I think it's something that we should take the time to celebrate. All right. So to start the discussion, I think we can, you know, I'm going to ask the panel to weigh in on a very broad question. So we know that the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was unveiled last year, almost exactly a year ago, was very well received in Taiwan. A few of us were on a trip earlier this summer to Taiwan, and I think overwhelmingly we were told that the IPS was welcome there. The document actually mentions Taiwan 8 times. So in the context of Canadian efforts towards, trade diversification, de-risking in the region, how do my fellow panelists see the role of Taiwan, be it as a trade or investment partner, but also maybe looking beyond at Taiwan presenting a learning opportunity for Canada when it comes to trade investment in the Indo-Pacific region? So I'm happy to go with whomever, we can start with you, Hugh, if you want, and whomever wants to weigh in.
Okay, thank you, Pascale. The Indo-Pacific strategy, the IPS, I guess it's now lacking the first part of that strategy. First leg, Indo, is not going to be too much done on that front right in the immediate future. But the IPS clearly marks a return by Canada to the region. I think I'm old enough to remember that we had Pacific 2000 at one point, and before that we probably had found other Asia-Pacific avocations. Anyway, this does provide a way to come back, but I think the IPS needs to be set in a broader context. So when I look at Canada's relations with Taiwan, and we're talking about resilient supply chains and what can Canada do, well, one thing Canada can do is strengthen its bilateral ties with Taiwan. I sort of see 4 elements. The first actually is our One China policy. And when we look at policy space, and the point was made by a couple of the MPs this morning, there is much more that we could do and should be doing that is legitimate within the existing policy space that we have with our One China policy. It was mentioned that I had the honor to head the office at one point, and I know there's one of my successors here in the audience today. And we always worked hard to try and keep pushing that rock uphill. And it was always difficult because there was I would say, almost a natural reluctance on the part of Ottawa to be too forward-leaning. And so we have been, if you'll forgive the expression, more Catholic than the Pope in some cases in terms of the way in which we've played our One China policy. There's lots of room for flexibility, whether it's visits by economic ministers, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Environment, whatever areas where we have room for engagement with Taiwan. We talked about the FIPA this morning. That should be finalized, and there's much more we could do on the trade front. So the existing trade space is one within the One China policy. I say the second, I think, is APEC. Both Canada and Taiwan are members of APEC. Taiwan, as we know, has problems finding legitimacy in international organizations. APEC and the WTO are 2 in which it does have full membership. So we should exploit that more fully. APEC is doing some good work in many areas, but also on supply chains, and so that's an area we could put more attention on. The third, and we'll probably come to a separate question on this, is the CPTPP. And I agree with the comments again made earlier that Canada could be more active, could provide more leadership. I know Meredith is going to talk about it. We'll be the chairs next year. I have my own views on the likely outcome of the pending memberships, and there are 6, by the way, 6 countries that have stepped up to say we want to be part of this organization. That's beyond the UK, including, if you can believe it, Ukraine. But the ones that we're most concerned about, of course, are China and Taiwan, and whether they go together, one will stop the other, what the rules are, how they're going to be applied, what the other members think, and so forth. So Canada has a role to play there. And then we come to the Indo-Pacific strategy, which can put some substance on the table in terms of funding. One thing we might think about, I really welcome this particular forum, the Ottawa Dialogue, and I'm told it's going to be the first of a number. One thing we could think about is something like a Canada-Taiwan forum, like we have a Canada-Korea forum. We've had 20 of these since they were established. There used to be a Canada-Japan forum, which is probably not the right model. That was very high level with representatives appointed by the heads of government and so forth. But the Canada-Korea forum has done good work. It has a counterpart organization, the Seoul Forum for International Affairs in Korea, and it's varied. It's been the Asia-Pacific Foundation. It's been CG, I believe right now it's perhaps Carleton University. But it does what this forum is doing, but also perhaps reaches out to a wider group. So that may be something that could be thought about, but then how do you do it? Well, perhaps the Indo-Pacific strategy could help. There's this, I think, $25 million allocated. Maybe that's not that much for the whole Asia-Pacific, for the regional engagement initiatives. We keep waiting for this to be rolled out. When is the, we've seen all the advertisement on TV, but when is the product actually going to be available? And I think we're still waiting. But when it does get rolled out, I would hope very much that institutions in Canada and Taiwan would take advantage of this funding to build these people-to-people ties that we've talked about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Anyone else on the wants to
I'll
weigh
do
in?
2 quick
Yeah.
seconds because I know this is a Canada question, but I do just want to point out that the American Indo-Pacific strategy, like the Canadian strategy, one of the good things in the United States is bipartisanship over China issues. And it's something that is really pretty extraordinary to see in these unusual times in my own country, that there is an area where there is almost complete alignment between the two parties, and that is over China-Taiwan issues. So having that bipartisan Indo-Pacific strategy, first developed under the Trump administration and then a new iteration under the Biden administration, focuses on having, and one of the questioners last session talked about free and open Indo-Pacific, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's not incumbent on one country to guarantee a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's incumbent on all of us to collaborate, like-minded countries, and to work with Taiwan and Japan and Korea to ensure that we have this free and open Indo-Pacific. And the last point on it is that Taiwan has proven itself to be indispensable, as the ambassador said in his opening keynote during COVID, where PPE and masks were the initial foray into why Taiwan is consequential in the world, and moving then rapidly into supply chain resilience and Taiwan's ability to supply the world with needed technologies. And so to your question about the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think that every country, like-minded country that looks toward Indo-PACOM or the Indo-Pacific region is looking at it through the very same clear lenses of where the real strategic threat lies.
Thank you for this. Meredith or Carlo?
So first, thanks to the organizers, Bijan and the team, for putting the conference together. And thanks for including a good representation from Western Canada. For Indo-Pacific and for engagement in the West, in all reality, it is about Western Canada. We are two-thirds of everything that leaves Canada comes from Western Canada. For agriculture, it's 3/4 from the prairies itself. So good on you for having the voice of those who actually deal with the strategy on a day-to-day basis in the room. In terms of the question, Pascale, on diversification, I'll address this not just from the Western perspective, but from the Canadian historical perspective, the America strategy. The last time Canada had a foreign policy strategy was the America strategy. And I think our experience there urges caution and modesty when thinking about the potential of policy and the potential of government, the potential of Ottawa to move the needle, especially on the trade front. No one in this room trades. No one in the government of Ottawa trades. It's the private sector. The private sector is going to decide, based on business reasons, whether or not to diversify. There is no diversification pixie dust that can be sprinkled by government policy to have businesses move. So that modesty in what we can do and can expect needs to be the starting point. Look only at the US and all the money and government effort made to diversify softwood lumber. And the numbers have moved. Well, they've moved, but they've moved with US housing starts. not with policy and not with government interventions. So that bit of modesty urges some caution about the question and the aspirations of diversification. On the other hand, we now have a security element in trade. And security is now, as we say at Canada West, is now the dog that wags the trade tail, as opposed to what we've been used to in Canada, the other way around. So given those realities, what can be done? I think TPP, sorry. Get tripped over the syllables. It's not a political statement, it's a linguistic statement. With the TPP, we can take the government role to nudge, facilitate, or get out of the way the marginal things the government can do. I think the TPP offers an opportunity to, in the longer term, start laying the foundations for supply chains, rules of origin, movement of people. These are things that can be subject to government movement. We're not going to move more coal, canola, or cattle to Taiwan. We've been trying for years. Alberta has a trade representative on the ground. If you really want to move trade, money or having a trade rep from the province actually trying to move goods is an immense help, and we haven't seen it. So I think we need to think about the next generation of trade, not corn, cattle, and canola, but start thinking about things in the future. And the TPP, I think, offers an institutional framework to do that. And the other note of caution, there's the institutional framework and the physical framework, and that's China and the Belt and Road. The literal roads, ports, connectivity are being furnished to link trade corridors to China. So as you think about diversification and the role that China plays in the region, you have to recalibrate your thinking, not aspirationally, but to the realities on the ground. And the reality of what China is building is a reality that we have to contend with in our thinking and our planning. Meredith, do you want to come on, America strategy?
He's moderator now, too,
Yeah,
Pascale.
that's right. That's okay, I'm not precious. I'm aware of Bijan's and IPD's suggestion that we focus on actionable policy recommendations as much as possible, both for, the government of Canada, I guess, or even other governments if relevant. So, keeping what we've said in mind, is there anything that you would advise, bearing what Carlo just said about how much we can, do with policy in mind, is there anything that you would advise the Canadian government to do better, specifically, thinking either about fostering deeper economic ties with Taiwan, or even in the context, Hugh, you mentioned, there's more space than we allow ourselves to take on the One China policy, anything that you could kind of going one step further into actionable policy recommendations. Do you have anything on that front?
I'll start. Because I will pick up on a couple of things that Carlo said. And the only thing I would have said in the first question was the people in this room don't trade, and Carlo said that. And so when we take that then to actionable recommendations for what the government should be doing, I think where I would differ a little with Carlo is that I do think there are all kinds of policy levers that the government can press or not press to encourage the private sector to then engage in trade. So what business is seeking when they're looking to expand trade is certainty, stability. They're more interested in carrots than sticks. Sticks are okay as long as they apply to everyone equally. And so there are things I think that government can do. What I would say, I think, about the Canadian government's approach lately under the IPS is that from where I sit, it is a rather preachy approach to the region. It is very much from a Canadian-centric position of what Canada wants from the region, including Taiwan. And frankly, Taiwan has a much more sophisticated sense of itself in the region, what it wants from us. as well as a bunch of other countries in the region. So, I often look to Japan. Japan is a leader in the region, and we could do a lot better by listening more. We could do a lot better by looking at what the region wants from us. One of the main things the region wants from us is energy. What does the current government not want to give to the region? Energy. And so, that's a problem. What does Taiwan want? Oil and gas, And so I think that we need to be much more aware of what trading partners in the region are looking for from us, including Taiwan. I think that we need to spend less time placing sticks around the conditions in which companies trade. We can do more to send positive signals about the kinds of trading relationships the government will encourage. Companies have a very long-term approach to investment decisions, so we can't have a position one day that's a different position the next day. And then the final thing I would say is that at the regulatory, in the regulatory space, Canada needs to move a lot faster. We have so many ways in which we're binding our own hands around enabling trade and trade facilitation. And so enabling, creating the conditions to allow companies to move faster is a big area that we need to improve.
Thank you for that. Hugh, do you have thoughts, or do you want to expand on your comment that I picked up on?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so accepting that trade agreements can provide an opening but don't actually trade. Absolutely true. Governments don't trade, businesses trade. We can talk about diversifying away from China, but if you happen to be Canadian Tire and your stuff is coming from China with a supplier that provides it on time at the right price, you're going to continue buying it from that place, regardless of what the government has to say about diversification. Or if you're an exporter and you've got a trusted customer, you'll follow. However, I think everybody recognizes that there's a need for diversification. You can't have all your eggs in one basket, that some trade has been weaponized, and so we want to diversify. And one of the ways to send the signal is to put in place the trade architecture to do that, so that at the very least, Canadian business is not disadvantaged vis-a-vis competing businesses from other countries, and thus we can perhaps come to the TPP. Used to be able to I used to be able to say the TPP 11, but now of course the UK has joined. It's back to being 12 again. So I guess anyway we're stuck with that. So everybody in the room knows that both China and Taiwan have applied, that Taiwan would like to become a member of the CPTPP for economic reasons, but probably also certainly for political reasons, because it's not represented in many organizations. China applied 1 week before Taiwan did. And so where does that leave us, along with the other countries that are in this process? So one has to, and then Canada is a member, along with the now other 11 members, and so the members have to work together. The initial position was, well, the UK is applying, so let's focus on the UK, and we'll just put all these other ones aside, which is fine, probably makes sense. The UK has now acceded, and that provides some sort of a track record. So then the question becomes, how do the members of the CPTPP deal with all of these applications, but particularly the ones of China and Taiwan, and what is Canada's role? I think it's fair to say, from what I can detect, that Canada is in favor of Taiwanese membership. Canada, I don't think it's actually said that. It said that it's in favor of countries that meet the requirements and are prepared to, play by the rules and so forth. Taiwan has undertaken a lot of steps to do that, to meet what some people would call the dress code. So, arguably, it's ready to proceed. But, we have the China factor. Just because China applied first doesn't mean it has to be dealt with first, and that's what the countries have to try and figure out. So we're in this situation of dealing with multiple applications. You also have to consider, what is China's motivation? Did China do it to simply show up the U.S. because it was, after all, a U.S. invention to begin with? Did China do it because it really wants to get the economic benefits of the CPTPP, which I doubt, because it already has agreements with everybody in that group except for Canada, Mexico, and the UK. Did China do it to change the rules so that if it got in, it would water down or change that trade agreement so it would be more like others, like the RCEP? Or did it do it just to scramble the cards and make life difficult for Taiwan? So, I mean, nobody can be sure what the motivations are. You can all have your ideas. Nobody will know for sure until we start these accession processes and the countries put forward their recommendations onto the table. And it's complicated by the others as well. So the organization has to decide what it's going to do, and Canada has to decide what it's going to do. And I guess I would argue that Canada could play a much more active role instead of just kind of hiding in the middle of the pack and saying, well, you know, we'll go with the flow. It could speak out more actively to move the process forward for countries or for economies, to use APEC speak, that are qualified, of which Taiwan is an eminent member. Now, in terms of the reality, I think probably everybody would agree with that. But then there are political realities in all of these organizations as well that you know, one has to take account of. And so, you know, you have to consider the other 11 partners and how likely it is that Taiwan and how the China-Taiwan issue would be dealt with. There are 4, perhaps 5 possibilities, you know. Both are admitted, neither are admitted. China's admitted, Taiwan's not. Taiwan's admitted, China's not. Or what I think is probably most likely is that this is just kicked down the road. The can, that's what's happened so far, but the UK's been an excuse. So you just prolong the process and never quite come to a decision until you're forced to make a decision. Regrettably, I think that's going to be the most likely outcome. And if it does, I would like to make a suggestion, since you were talking about actionable outcomes. So Canada, as part of the other members, will be seeking offers from the interested parties, working prior to any working party being established. I understand that all this informal dialogue goes on. And eventually you get to a point where for the 6 applicants, and then maybe more, you'll have a green, red, or yellow sort of situation. And I'm assuming in the case of Taiwan, it will be green. But if the other countries aren't prepared to move forward at that point, then I think Canada should consider taking the acquis, the offer that's on the table, and saying, let's take this offline. Let's see if we can negotiate a bilateral agreement, as indeed the U.S. is doing with Taiwan right now. So I think the priority should be on CPTPP. There should be some leadership shown by Canada to make it clear that it's for qualified applicants. And if Taiwan is one, that's fine. And if that doesn't happen because some of the other countries are likely to drag their feet or whatever, then consider option B, which would be to take it bilaterally.
Thank you for this. As people in the room will know, indeed, Canada will be chair of CPTPP next year, 2024. So this is actually a very relevant question. Since you've brought this up, you know, any reactions to what Hugh is saying? And then maybe, Bonnie, if you want to weigh in, I'm prepared to kind of carve a little U.S. question for you out of this, which is there any world in which the U.S. can rejoin CPTPP ever? And what would that world look like? But first, Carlo or Meredith, whichever. Yeah.
You go first.
Thanks. So in following up to the original question, the policy levers that would be effective, I think one of the more effective levers we've seen in moving trade is massive amounts of money. The IRA, the $2.2 billion that Japan's put down for grants to get Japanese companies to actually move back to Japan, or $20 billion to move to other markets. If you don't have that sort of money, then you're looking at other aspects. But you have to take into fact that others are spending that sort of money, and that will impact Canadian trade. We know about the pull of the IRA money in the U.S. So if you think about diversification vis-a-vis China and Taiwan, you have to think about what other actors are doing too. It's not just a Canadian question. But what can the Canadian government do? You know, knowledge is one thing. Making companies more comfortable with the Taiwanese market, because the contextual knowledge of the geopolitical situation, the contextual knowledge of how Taiwan, the economy of Taiwan fits into the regional economies can make, I think, business a bit more comfortable and give them a bit more certainty. It's one of our main advantages in the U.S. Businesses have massive amounts of information about the U.S. market, about the U.S. political system, that makes their investments more manageable, gives them more confidence. It's not just geographic proximity. The other thing to think about is certainty in Canada. And this is certainty that with a change in government, and at some point in the future, 10 years, 100 years from now, there will be a change in government, but that policy will continue through changes in government. With the Harper government, we saw the Americas strategy appear by surprise for many of us, and then disappear during the government, but certainly when the government left. So certainty, I think, from the opposition. There's a role for the opposition to articulate clear policies towards Taiwan and toward the region that can help to give certainty for something where there is currently bipartisan consensus. So those two issues I would put on as things that can be done in the near term. But there's certainly a role for the opposition and for the provinces to step up and articulate clear positions, because without the provinces speaking, there's not that much certainty about what Canada will or will not do in reality in the region.
Thank you. Meredith?
So just coming back to the TPP accession process, which I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about, and so some of the other countries that are applying in addition to Taiwan and China include Costa Rica, Uruguay, Ukraine, Ecuador. Korea indicated that it would, but it hasn't actually formally applied for a bunch of reasons that those familiar with the Korean Japanese politics will be familiar with. It's my strong view that the process of accession, bringing in more members, has to continue. And so, as Hugh said, China put in its application a week before Taiwan put its application forward, and everyone knew Taiwan's application was coming. So we have to really wonder about that timing. And if China's goal was simply to stop Taiwan from joining, we actually have to stop that. We have to deal with it. And we can't allow China to succeed in kind of blocking this process. So Canada's going to take the lead, and some of what I'm going to recommend is just the continuation of a process that's already underway, and again, Japan has taken leadership in this area. But I really think Canada's position actually has to be to look at rules and standards and ambition, and to hold that up as the standard by which any country could join. But those standards have to be really, really high, and they have to be based on proven activity already in place. So it can't be that China promises it will open up its economy in the future. It can't be that China promises it'll suddenly start being nice to Canadian companies based in China. We can't allow that to be the standard. Instead, the standard has to be countries that have open economies, that allow foreign companies to operate and be treated similarly to domestic companies, that don't have major state-owned enterprises except for an agreed carved-out list, which is what exists currently for other members. Something that's been recommended, which I strongly agree with, is looking at the record of how applicants deal with current trade disputes. So if you look at how a country behaves in the rules-based international order on trade, that should be used as an indicator as to whether or not you can join TPP. If you observe rulings, if you abide by the rules, if you accept defeat when you lose, then maybe you should be part of CPTPP. And if you can't demonstrate those things, then you shouldn't. And the reason that I recommend that type of process, maybe you'll have a much longer list, but that type of rules-based process to which China can apply, Taiwan can apply, Uruguay can apply, is that it attempts to depoliticize this issue of we will block China, but we will let Taiwan in. I don't think that's a constructive process for Taiwan or for other countries that are seeking to join. And so by trying to depoliticize this process, we can look to some of the bigger countries that are already part of CPTPP. Japan, Australia, Canada, and now the UK are the largest economies in the TPP. But there are others in the TPP who don't have the same position on China. And accession to TPP is a consensus-based process. So just because we're big and influential countries doesn't mean that we don't vote on this. It is consensus-based. And so how do you bring along those other countries that are in TPP for whom China is their largest trading partner and who don't want to be asked to pick between the West and China? What you do is you make it about standards, ambition, rules, demonstrated record of success, and then everyone can agree on that list. And so the only other things I'll say about this is that a rules-based approach should, I agree with Hugh, allow Taiwan to join. It likely will not allow China to join. There may be others on that list who will be able to join quickly and others who won't. But I don't think that we should be considering them all as a block or not. I think if there is a country like Costa Rica, actually probably the easiest one to let in tomorrow. And so why should Costa Rica have to line up behind a decision on China? I don't think it should. So again, if you have that list of criteria, then you deal with that. And then the final thing is that I think that this is the only approach that can ever open the door to the return of the US. And I won't say whether I think that's likely or not, because Bonnie can tell us.
Could I just jump in with a very quick aside? Sorry, Bonnie, but with all due respect to my American friends, if we were to apply Meredith's criteria of whether applicants deal with, how they deal with current disputes and whether they accept defeat, I would say that given the U.S. blockage of the dispute settlement mechanisms at the WTO, it's just as well the U.S. is not an applicant.
And our own non-adherence to the dairy rulings on USMCA, I will add, as well as TPP.
We're going to be very un-Canadian with Bonnie, but let me follow Hugh's point.
Well, I think we should give Bonnie a
just-
chance to speak. Okay.
So, just 2 seconds. So, the Country of Origin Labeling Enforcement Act of 2023, no ruling by the World Trade Organization or by any other international organization of which the United States is a member that is established before, on, or after the date of enactment of this act may be construed to limit, alter, or affect the authority of the Secretary of Agriculture to require country of origin labeling in accordance with this act. So, in terms of, this is an issue that's not followed, I think, nationally, but for us out west, $1 billion a year, cattle crossing the border 2 or 3 times a year, and unilateral actions like this worry us. So I think that standard could be problematic if it were to be taken by, say, China and say, okay, let's look at the WTO and the history of complaints and following complaints at the WTO. So I would just caution that it's a bit more nuanced than simply adhering to the international rules-based system. This is something we've managed to deal with. We deal with the U.S. that breaks the rules on a regular basis, and we've managed to survive that trade relationship. I'm not saying that as a policy recommendation. I'm simply entering that as a fact and evidence for consideration and informing thinking.
Well, we've set the stage beautifully for you, Bonnie. Welcome to Canada. Yeah.
Here we go. Saddle up. So, in answer to your original question, Pascale, is there anything that would get the United States to join CPTPP? I think the answer to that, at least in the short term being, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years, the answer is probably no. And that there's, as I said in my opening comments, there is strong bipartisan support for China, the U.S.-China policy vis-a-vis Taiwan. Strong bipartisan support for Taiwan, strong rhetoric as well as policy enactments against the People's Republic of China. There's another area that has very strong bipartisan support, And it's very puzzling to me because intellectually, I'm a free trader. I believe in free trade. I believe in open markets. But unions on the left and nationalistic policy adherence on the right are a bond that will keep the United States out of these grand trade deals for the long run, for the short run, maybe not in the long run. We're smarting from WTO. We're smarting is an American term, maybe not a Canadian term. We're hurting from WTO. We're hurting reputationally from the push that we made and exerted our influence to bring China into the WTO. We see that now, in retrospect, as having been a grand mistake. Because China, to Meredith's point, made promises and they have never delivered on those promises. And the one thing, Meredith, that you didn't mention that is an important standard to adhere to in any trade discussions is theft of intellectual property. And the Chinese break the rules all the time, and American companies, which really are the ones who are going to be the proponents for or against entering trade agreements, American companies are hurting from, especially tech companies, the tremendous theft of intellectual property developed in the United States. So I think that's the short to medium term approach that the United States is going to take. Trade is insanely unpopular in both political parties. We're heading into an election where trade will likely not even be an issue in debates, if we even have debates, because no one likes it on either side of the far left or of the far right, and they tend to be the ones who drive the base in both parties. You asked a question about Hugh posed the question of what was the PRC's goal in applying for CPTPP, and he listed about 5 different things. Was it to stick their finger in Taiwan's eye, or was it to stick their finger in the Americans' eye, and a variety of things in between? The answer is yes, on all of the above. China is not a serious applicant to CPTPP. And should be viewed, Meredith, I think, very rightly if you follow a recipe for what it takes to enter into free trade agreements. You'll see that China is not a serious contender for that space. And Taiwan is. Costa Rica is. Uruguay is. There are a lot of potential members that you can get Mexico behind. There's a whole bunch going on. At the end of the day, the United States, with its Indo-Pacific economic approach, decided to take Taiwan offline. I actually view that as a mistake of this administration. I think it should have been incorporated into discussions. One of the nice things about being the United States is that we wield an outsized amount of influence with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, and I think that we could have made a very strong case for Taiwan to be part of free trade discussions with the rest of the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific region. But if we have and we make progress, true progress toward a free trade agreement with Taiwan, I think that's an important step nonetheless.
Thank you so much for this. Let's just shift gears slightly to touch on the question, more specifically of supply chains, including semiconductor industry supply chains and critical minerals supply chains, and the central position that Taiwan occupies, in those. So do you have any thoughts on how Canada or the US should think about the central critical place that Taiwan occupies in the context of increasing, geopolitical tensions across the Pacific? How do you think about this, and how should the Canadian government or companies think about this?
I'm going to jump in on this because I actually worked in the semiconductor industry at IBM. And and this is another area of bipartisan alignment. The CHIPS, what became known as the CHIPS and Science Act, began in the Trump administration as the Endless Frontiers Act, with a lot more money behind it because it was pre-COVID. And so we were in discussions to have legislation and funding to expand our technology markets with incentives from the federal government to the technology industry in the United States to build out what we called endless frontiers. And this would have incorporated both the semiconductor industry as well as the rest of the larger technology ecosystem. Enter COVID and enter Joe Biden, and you get a much more gelled down version into what's now the CHIPS and Science Act, but which is still an extremely important and also bipartisan piece of legislation. The key is going to be in the implementation of this, and it's slow to get off the ground because, as everybody has said correctly, government should not be in the way of getting private industry to act, and businesses are the ones who are going to be implementing the CHIPS Act. But the recognition through COVID that Taiwan plays an essential role in global supply chains is something that is not lost on anyone who has any electronic component anywhere in their lives. So we need Taiwan. Ambassador Young said this, Taiwan is in everybody's pocket because we all carry smartphones with us. That's really important to recognize. And with Taiwan's critical role, there comes this very scary question for policymakers, which is what happens if China invades Taiwan? The last panel, I think very correctly, talked through why that's going to be very, very slow in coming, if it comes at all. But the chances are far more likely of an economic or trade blockade coming out of China. And what does that mean for the rest of the world, for the semiconductor industry? And Taiwanese companies, TSMC, but not limited to TSMC, SK Hynix, many people in the ecosystem of Asian semiconductors are realizing that they have to broaden beyond the, say, 4 countries that have a very big hand to play in the semiconductor industry, and to branch out manufacturing of semiconductors. TSMC, for example, announced a $20 billion initial investment in the state of Arizona. Your point, Carlo, about states' engagement is really, really important in the same way that it is for the provinces, because states are much closer to the jobs that are created from industry investment. So the investment initially by TSMC into the state of Arizona is running into something that came up in the context of the Navy in the last panel. You need trained people to work in the semiconductor industry. It's not a sweatshop operation. It's a highly sophisticated, technological, innovative process that requires investment. TSMC, we want to open in Arizona. I did a flight over the TSMC plant. Well, building the plant is coming along very nicely. Staffing the plant is going to be another issue. The United States depends on Taiwan, and this is something that Americans cannot underestimate. We depend on Taiwan for our technology, and because of that, the inextricable link, whether it's through semiconductors or through bicycles, right? With a new green environment, whatever it is, rare earths, technology, semiconductors, supply chains, we have to decouple. Some people now call it de-risk, but we have to make moves away from the People's Republic of China and to allied countries that can replace China as the unfair trading partner and lock on so many economies around the world.
Thank you. Any reactions to that, or any other thoughts about semiconductors? Hugh, go ahead. Hugh, and then
Go ahead,
or you.
go ahead, Meredith.
I was
Meredith,
just
go
going to touch on the critical minerals end of this, because I think that the biggest thing that Canada can do to be part of a secure, stable supply chain where we de-risk our own potential lack of access to what are essential components of the 21st century is to rapidly accelerate the extraction of critical minerals in Canada. And that comes back to regulation. And there's lots of great talk that we've heard in Canada over the last couple of years about this. I'm a big proponent of what I call hewers of wood, drawers of water 2.0. I have a paper about this. And stopping the vilification of natural resource extraction in Canada. But we have to move much more quickly on environmental approvals. And if you look at the last week of newspaper stories on this, we're moving much too slowly. And it is our negotiating leverage. Having that supply is our negotiating leverage around this issue. So we need to get on with the part of it that we own.
Thank you. Hugh, go ahead, and then Carlo.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Bonnie's point about de-risking, which for a while was called reshoring or friendshoring, and the critical role that Taiwan plays in semiconductor chip production. I mean, the chips are developed in the U.S., the machines are developed in the Netherlands, but TSMC and its sort of sister companies has mastered the art of producing these things to scale, and we're dependent upon them, particularly Canada, because of its automotive industry. And so it's interesting in terms of looking at de-risking, because to the extent that Taiwan is a critical supplier, and it supplies also to China, by the way, but not the latest generation of chips, but critical chips for us. It has what many people refer to as its silicon shield, right? It's unthinkable that this supply chain would be disrupted. So what's the U.S. solution? Well, let's move part of it to Arizona. In fact, a big part of it has now been doubled. I think it's $40 billion. I'm sure there are going to be all kinds of HR challenges to get people in Arizona to work in a fab with all that's required and so on. But nonetheless, the U.S., through the CHIPS Act, I think rightly, is trying to repatriate some of that production capacity, which started in the U.S., and now there are plants being built by Intel and others, your company, I suppose. So at the same time that we are de-risking, we may be increasing the risk, in a sense, on Taiwan. I'm sure Taiwan, there's debate in this in Taiwan, what should we do about this? Can we resist it? Should we resist it? My understanding is that, in fact, the output of this plant in Arizona, which has now been pushed back to 2025, the final steps will be still back in Taiwan. And the IP and the latest generation and all that sort of stuff, I guess, will rest. Certainly if I was in charge of the company, I want to hold on to that. But it's almost like a two-edged sword. So to de-risk, we diversify, we bring some of the production back. Does that make Taiwan more vulnerable? I mean, it's a critical player. If the risk to Taiwan increases and it's a critical player, then we need to defend Taiwan. And we should defend Taiwan, not just because we should speak out about security. I'm not saying Canada should jump in and defend Taiwan, but we should play our collective role, not because Taiwan and TSMC produces chips for GM in Windsor, but because of all the other things we've talked about, the common values and democracy and the rules-based order and those sorts of things. But of course, the chip production is a piece of it. And to the extent that we're an appendage to the U.S. economy and that our automotive industry is integrated with the North American industry, we are just as vulnerable in that particular sector as any U.S. corporation.
Carlo.
So, two thoughts about the diversification of supply and production chains in this context. One, this is to now an import question for Canada. If you look at the composition of our trade, what we export to Taiwan, to the economy of Taiwan, is coal. Far and away, I think it's 10 times larger than the next the next product on HS4, HS2 level. So that doesn't require much, and there's not much room there in terms of diversification of supply and production chains. We aren't able to diversify, as you pointed out, LNG to help Taiwan move from coal to LNG because we can't build the plants. There's no consensus on exporting cleaner energy to replace coal that we seem to export and that BC seems to welcome as an export from the province, along with hypocrisy, I think. But
It's not, it's thermal coal, or metallurgical coal, I should say.
it's coal. So the other issue, though, is if you want to move to critical minerals, you're going to need to build mines. You're going to need to build roads from mines to processing plants. You're going to need to build facilities, bulk facilities, transport facilities. Canada is one of the few G8, I think the only G8 country, one of the few OECD countries. Okay, fine. That doesn't have national trade infrastructure planning. The money that we have for the Corridor and Gateway Fund is, I think, 400 million Canadian a year, which is next to nothing. And that's for the entire integrated supply and production chains going east to Europe, going south to the US, and going out through the Asia-Pacific Gateway. But even if we had more money, we don't have the data or the capacity to turn data into information to know where to invest to improve fluidity in our supply and production chains. So Meredith is right to point out the problems with regulation, but even if we solve that problem, look, there's a reason the global perception of our trade infrastructure has dropped from top 10 to 32nd globally over the last decade. And it's this lack of planning capacity. So in terms of being able to operationalize desires or aspirations to move supply and production chains, we are really, really behind the 8 ball in Canada. We don't have the money, and even if we had the money, we wouldn't know where to spend it to affect these sorts of changes.
I might throw a last question, but note to the audience that we'll be opening up for questions soon, so start thinking about your own. But just before we go to questions, Bonnie, you mentioned, the likelihood of different scenarios, worsening scenarios across the strait, and mentioned that, a blockade or economic or trade blockade would be more likely. How do my fellow panelists think about risk, or how do you think you would advise the Canadian government or Canadian firms to think about risk across the Taiwan Strait, given the last exchange that we've had? Is there anything that you would, any kind of fresh angle or ideas that you would help us think this through? Bonnie.
So I think one of the things that's really clear in focus in everyone's mind is actually not in this part of the world, but in Israel, and what's being called an intelligence failure in Israel to predict the Hamas massacres. And one of the reasons that's being given at this point in time is that there was a massive cyber attack on Israeli intelligence. And this may or may not be true, I don't know. But if that is the case, and Israel has one of the strongest cybersecurity infrastructures in the world, it undoubtedly was a joint Chinese-Iranian operation directed against Israel. You can imagine a similar joint operation directed against Taiwan. And I think in terms of where the greatest risk comes in the Taiwan Strait, it is in the area of cybersecurity, cyber defense, cyber penetration, and turning this into a really global issue. Let's bring in our friends in Ukraine and how the Ukrainians, and by extension even more so how the Estonians, protect NATO and are trying to protect Ukraine against Russian cyber attacks that are basically around the clock. This is an area where I think also the private sector comes into play, but so do joint intelligence collaborations. And so from both, we'll call it B to B and G to G levels, whether it's companies in the free world advising Taiwan on Taiwanese companies on cybersecurity protections, or governments from the free world who have experienced cyber attacks from these malign actors. I think that's going to be the space where Taiwan is perceived as being most vulnerable. And not because of anything Taiwan has done or said or possesses, but because this is the backdoor way in to attempts to impact Taiwan's vibrant economy and Taiwan's vibrant supply chain. And so my recommendation to both the Canadian industry, the Taiwanese industry, as well as to free world governments, is to harden those cybersecurity vulnerabilities, be like Estonia, double, triple, quadruple harden those cybersecurity protections. And that will be a way, at least, that the first wave of Chinese attempts to undermine Taiwan will be thwarted.
Any other comments from the panel on how to think about risk across the Taiwan Strait for Canadian government, Canadian companies? How would you advise on that?
I'll take it.
Anyone? Yeah.
I'm not a government official anymore, but I think government officials have to be very careful about advising businesses where to put their investments and their risks. You can offer some advice. But I mean, if you were talking to a company about investing in Taiwan or trading in Taiwan, are there risks? Of course there are risks, and business is pretty good at calculating those risks. And I think any business sensibly has a degree of diversification. It has a business recovery plan. But I guess what I wanted to say is that I think we have to be careful not to slip into the cycle of defeatism or self-fulfilling prophecy. Director Zhang mentioned this morning the sort of the economist view that Taiwan's the most dangerous place on earth versus it's a great place to do business and so on. So there are those are the extremes. And I was, like some of you in the room, in Taiwan fairly recently. I was impressed by the vitality. We know there are opportunities. I think we have to work on the assumption and if we're talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, it certainly works on the assumption that we can do more with Taiwan. It talks about S&T partnerships. It talks about working with Taiwan on SMEs, a whole range of things. So there's no suggestion that it's too risky to work with Taiwan. In fact, I am not suggesting that a company should put its assets on the line simply to prove a point, but I also think that there are lots of opportunities in Taiwan, that every business looks forward probably to a 3 to 5 year plan, and that it's very important to assess the resilience of Taiwan and the expressions that we heard earlier this morning of self-reliance, the Ukrainian example, whatever example that you want, that if you help yourself, people will help you. I think Canada has an important role as part of a much broader coalition in sending a message that sending us a non-defeatist message, a positive message, not a Pollyanna message, not to dismiss the threats, but not to give in to some sort of gloomy, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Thank you for that. Carlo?
So from a Western Canadian perspective, and again, the region, the country that does the most exporting, Taiwan is, the importance of Taiwan to the West and to Canada. Well, for Western Canada, I think, or for the prairies certainly, Taiwan shows up as, I think, 9th out of the 16 top economies in the Indo-Pacific that are identified in the strategy in terms of volume of value of exports, sorry. And a lot of that is, the things that we export, corn, cattle, canola. So in terms of diversification of supply chains, management of risk, there's not much that can be done. And the smaller volumes, I think, with Taiwan, limit the direct risk. But this is the bilateral issue. When you expand and look at regional trade, then the risks become apparent. A broader conflict that disrupts trade in the region or that impacts the movement of goods in and out of the Chinese market does pose a significant risk. There, we've been trying various diversification strategies with some success, but I think the risk vis-a-vis China is about to decrease markedly. I don't really see us selling canola to China in the next few years. And that has to do with the crush industry, renewable diesel. For those of you that follow the Western economy closely, you're familiar with this situation. So that may cut some of the risk down for us, but that's a natural occurring phenomenon in the Western economy, moving to respond to changes, structural or foundational changes in the market. But the wider risk, it's not the bilateral issue. Again, Taiwan's 9 out of 16 for us on the prairies, but it's the wider implications that we have to start thinking about. And that's something where I think a lot of work needs to be done. We can do some contingency planning now to avoid some of the issues we've run into in the past that we've seen recently with other economies in the region.
I would just add, I agree with Carlo. I think the risk in the region is up. The latest news out of the Philippines and blockades against Philippine boats is a pretty worrying development. And so generally, firms are spending a lot more time, energy, money worried about geopolitical risk writ large. To Bonnie's point, Ukraine, the Hamas attacks on Israel, South China Sea, the number of cascading issues at the moment is really worrying for global firms. And so in general, firms that are involved in international trade do need to be spending more time, energy, resources focused on the risk profile. And I think the region more generally, I would give similar advice right now to firms operating in the region generally, as opposed to Taiwan exclusively.
Thank you so much for that. We have some time set aside for questions, so I would encourage you who have questions to pose to the panel to either go to the microphone there. I guess that's the way to proceed. And please introduce yourself to the panel and maybe indicate who your question is for, whether it's for the panel or someone in particular. Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Kurt Simpson with Defense Research. This is really an open question, and it was part of a theme that got touched on near the end. But when you're looking at China, it now leads in 36 of 44 critical core technological areas. When you actually look at Canada's public and private investment, the government has invested in quantum and AI, cyber as well. There's also undersea technologies. And when you look at that as a nexus, to me, when we're trying to target areas that we would focus on, emerging and disruptive technologies is really at the heart of everything, because it's where the public sector and the private sector intersect. It's where the economic and the security sector intersect. And it's where the national and the international intersect, because that's the key to AUKUS Tier 2 is critical technologies.
We can take a couple, and maybe, so sir, please come ahead. We'll take 2 questions, and then the panel can answer both.
Yes, Jacob Cavallo, Carleton University. I'd like to just mention, without going into any kind of detail, that when it comes to the issue of the October the 7th attack against Israel, there's a very significant and usually not mentioned point of the domestic roots that facilitated that attack, and I'll just leave it at that. When it comes to Taiwan, one cannot ignore what Taiwan has done after being dealt a terrible hand in 1979. So I'm so elated and happy, and of course learning all the time from this incredible panel of people bruised in trade negotiations over the years. I'd like to suggest two things. One is, in the context of experience that we've had with China, not to disconnect between trade and politics ever. If we consider in the Chinese context what happened to France in the Carrefour affair, Japan in the context of the so-called nationalization of the Senkaku, and then South Korea, reaction to the THAAD, and so on. So negotiations with regard to the two applicants, China and Taiwan, should be done in a way that membership in the CPTPP would have to have a very strong connection between politics, regime, if you will, past behaviors, and last, I think, trade consequences, if you will. The second point deals with enhancing as much as possible, with Canada very much up there, the international space of Taiwan. I remember, to my horror, in February and March 2020, when the Canadian representative on the WHO was the attack dog for Dr. Ghebreyesus. Dr. Ghebreyesus, of course, being in Xi Jinping's back pocket when it comes to him becoming director of the WHO to begin with. So the WHA observer status, at least for Taiwan, and then the ICAO, the way we pronounce that sometimes, without even having to mention membership in the CPTPP.
Thank you. Whomever wants to offer thoughts first, go ahead, Bonnie.
I'm not sure that there were questions in either of those, but
You can make your own up.
so I'll talk just to the critical technologies issue, which I think is really important, and China's near stranglehold on innovation, or at least the perception of China's near stranglehold on innovation around the world. I think that that's a little bit of a false presumption. And it's because you have a vertically integrated economy, so that China can project the impression that it has a stranglehold on innovation and critical and emerging technologies, because everything from the university through Xi Jinping's mouth is vertically integrated. And we have the messy mass of the academy in the United States, industry in the United States, and government that are all focused on critical and emerging technologies and don't often talk to each other. So I would argue that we should be concerned about this projection that China has of being in total control of the most critical and emerging technologies out there, but I don't believe that in my heart of hearts, at least I hope. I know hope is not a strategy. We were talking about this at lunch. But I do think that Western innovation, the innovation coming out of the free world, is equal to the task.
Thank you.
I'll just
Meredith
add
and then Hugh. Yeah.
one thing about Jacob's raising some of the organizations that Taiwan has asked to be a member of or observer of. I think actually Canada should be playing a very loud advocacy role in this way. So ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority, mostly got that acronym right, but and yes, we all just talk about it like ICAO, the WHO. And most importantly, the WTO. Taiwan is a member of the WTO, and as CPTPP becomes, its membership in CPTPP becomes adjudicated, I believe this issue will come up over and over and over again with respect to the One China policy. But for Canada, there should be no debate. It's a member of the WTO. We can trade with Taiwan on its own terms, and we should be loudly making that point at every opportunity.
Thank you, Hugh.
On the critical technologies, I mean, whether they're critical or whether they're kind of key components, there's no question that China has huge penetration. I think about 2 or 3 years ago, the department produced a study based on supply use tables looking at the degree of dependence upon Chinese components by Canadian manufacturing. And in some industries, and the automotive one is one I know, and also electronic components, it was up in the high 70s in terms of the degree of dependence. And if you look broadly, the amount of Chinese inputs into most manufacturing processes is, I mean, it's almost universal. And it's self-evident because, well, they not only, they produce stuff for American companies in China that are then put back into components and so forth. So, you know, would those be things that China would weaponize? I suppose it's a risk. And I think that's ultimately what's behind part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, this encouragement of business to diversify and spread the risk. As we've already discussed, it's easy to say that. It's not so easy to do. But there are areas where, again, coming back to the IPS, where Canada privileges cooperation with Taiwan. So if we're looking at the area of AI, where Canada has a fairly good record, a competitive advantage in some areas, that's an area that where we could cooperate with Taiwan. I think it's well known that TSMC has a research facility in Ottawa. The Canadian telecoms industry has had its ups and downs, but we still have lots of assets. So we need to continue to look for opportunities to diversify to the extent that the government can provide a framework to encourage diversification through programs and through some financing, including with Taiwan, then that's a good thing.
Carlo, do you have a burning thought, or should we gather more questions?
Very quick. Sure, Carlo, quick. Infrastructure. The one thing that we can do to engage, to move supply and production chains from something specific, like critical minerals, walk backward from Taiwan's needs to what you need in Canada, not just the mines, but the processing facilities, the infrastructure. We can engage with specific markets to work on the infrastructure. The second point on infrastructure is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, Build Back Better.
Something like that.
Yeah. Which is the U.S.'s attempt to put $600 billion over 5 years on the table to counter the Belt and Road. So far, the Americans have managed to raise $30 billion in the first year. They're about $90 billion short of the target. So I think engaging, Canada stepping forward to engage there would be another way to concretely address not the institutional issue, but the physical issue of what supply and production chains move on, which is infrastructure. So those are two concrete ideas.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left for questions, and we have 3 people behind the microphone. So I suggest that we take the 3 lots of questions and then have all proceed with closing thoughts. We have Furuya-san now.
Thank you very much. My name is Tokuro Furuya. I'm Deputy Head of the Mission to the Japanese Embassy here in Ottawa. And my question is a very easy one, I guess, that, economic coercion is a big issue among the G7 countries. And we already, the issues are some of the statement about that. But my question is, what kind of the role Taiwan can play, or maybe Taiwanese government can play in this economic coercion issues? And especially some of you mentioned about the WTO APEC, is that Taiwan is the legitimate the member, and in that sense, I would like to hear from your point, your things. And last thing I would like to say that I really thank you for the TSMC to invest in the semiconductor in Kumamoto, which is a rural part of Japan, which also not only the economic security point of view of the semiconductor, but also the labor mobility issue. This is a very important issue. I just would like to thank you, the ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you for this.
Hi, Steve Chase. Just a question about this panel's fostering trade. You've talked a lot about multilateral efforts. You've talked a little bit about bilateral efforts. My question is about bilateral efforts. Why, many of you who either worked in government or with government, what is your best explanation for why even after the Indo-Pacific policy and its diversification efforts, there's been no Team Canada mission to Taiwan, a ministerial-led mission. We've had no ministers visit Taiwan since 1998, and it would seem to me that there must be a reason for this. I'd like your guys' best guess at that.
Thank you. And Jeff?
Thanks. I'm Jeff Mahan. I'm with Strategy Corp, where recently started a geopolitical risk advisory practice. So I'm really happy that there's near unanimous support from the panel that these types of services are in need. I just wish we had more companies here today so I could peddle off some of those services. And I was also a former Deputy Director of Global Affairs Canada. The conversation's quickly turning into kind of a China issue, but today's focus is on Taiwan. Recognizing that we want to diversify away from too much engagement with China, we got to keep in mind that fully pulling out, or the decoupling, is ultimately going to undermine some certain key interests in Canada and our own goals for long-term economic prosperity. So I think Bonnie made a good point about there's certain sectors that we need to be extra careful on, but there's other ones, including in the agriculture and energy, where we actually have some shared interests. How do we spin some of that over to Taiwan? Because we note that, like Canada, it's a smaller economy. It also has some trade barriers in place. I think some of them have been resolved fairly recently regarding beef or some issues like that. But at the end of the day, Taiwan can't replace China when it comes to Canadians' export portfolio. So where can we focus more, and what can we do to work with the Taiwanese government to also settle some of the, or maybe not settle, but look at reconciling some of the standards or regulatory aspects that get in the way of preventing trade? So I'd be just curious to hear what some views are there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Very quickly.
Very quickly. I'm Steve Hogberg. I'm policy lead at Public Policy Forum and formerly with Global Affairs Canada as well. To feed off of Jeff's comment, it might be also worthwhile looking at the EU as the other region of the world that is also decoupling with China, particularly when it comes to economic leverage, multilateral economic leverage and geopolitical leverage. And so because part of it is our view is West to Pacific, there are many different angles by which we can be understanding this process. Thank you.
I propose that we go in this order. Give you about 2 minutes each. I'm sorry, we're going on break at 30 past. And then, you can start, Hugh, and then we can go this way. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't know the EU was decoupling from China. I thought the Germans had been there in force and continue to be there. So there's various models. The question regarding what Canada and Canada and Taiwan could do to improve Canadian exports. I mean, this has been, the trade office has been there for over 30 years. There's been lots of dialogue. I think the standards, the barriers that were there, the non-tariff barriers, have basically been eroded. And if Taiwan enters the CPTPP, that will be enshrined. But it's a competitive market. We compete with the U.S. in a number of areas, and to be frank, quite often, if it's a default reaction, the Taiwanese default reaction, perhaps understandably, is let's buy U.S. Why no Team Canada missions to Taiwan? I'm not sure a Team Canada mission would accomplish what we need. In fact, Team Canada missions, frankly, are pretty passé, although I do know that recently it was called a Team Canada mission when Minister Ng went to Singapore with a bunch of companies. What would help, of course, though, I think, is some kind of government wrapping around. It doesn't have to be a whole Team Canada mission with all the premiers and all singing, all dancing and so forth, but perhaps some government wrapping around a private sector mission that was carefully prepared. Why hasn't that been the case? I would say over the last 20 years, excessive caution, not wanting to be provocative, looking at the balance of trade with our second largest individual export partner, although it's small compared to the U.S. So all of those reasons.
Most of the questions were specific to Canada, so I'll be short. My friend from the Japanese embassy raised the issue of having Taiwanese investment in rural Japan. This goes to something that Carlo has been talking about as well, the provinces. We in the United States talk about this all the time in terms of states and states having economic interests because they create jobs. Yes. Right? Get the Japanese out to Taiwanese companies, set up trade missions, and have Taiwanese companies visit the regions of Japan that you're interested in fostering more economic development in. That's very important. In terms of the EU, I agree, Steve, haven't discussed the EU. The EU is these days otherwise occupied, I think, a lot. But at the same time, the economic might and the joint economic might, I don't call it of the West. I really do call it the free world. When you call it the West, you ignore Asia and Western Canada, I guess. The economic might of the free world, I think, is something that if we weren't so caught up in our own sort of more petty disagreements, we might be able to clear through some of that noise and have coherent positions that make logical sense and back up other free world countries.
Thank you. Carlo?
So on the question of what can be done, I would echo Hugh's point. We've been at the Taiwanese market for decades, spent considerable resources for Canada. I would argue that what's been done is the result of those efforts. So again, the strategy comes in with this huge aspirational announcement. You have the announcement of a strategy, everything's going to change. It leads to expectations in the media and elsewhere that really I don't think match the reality on the ground. We have to be a bit more modest. In terms of visits, again, I would argue that if you want photo ops, have a Team Canada mission. If you want to move trade, have trade reps on the ground, day in, day out, doing the work. This is what the province of Alberta has. So even though Taiwan is 9 out of 16th, or 9th out of 16 TPP markets for the West, Alberta still invested the time and the resources to have someone on the ground. That's a hell of a lot more important than having the minister go over, Minister Jones go over, or Premier Smith go over. One sends a political signal. The other can do more, I think, to move trade, having someone work day in and day out. Final point, on the TPP, I think Hugh and for Meredith, one of the goals isn't necessarily, or one of the aims or potential gains for Canada is not necessarily if Taiwan joins. A lot can be done in doing the work with Taiwan on their ascension, modeling the agreement together to identify quantitative benefits, to identify sectors, bringing think tanks, Changhua and others together with Canadian groups to start forging the bonds of working together, to do the deeper track 2 think tank work, build those connections. We have money in the IPS for this sort of investment. Canada, which is normally cheap and complacent, is actually going to spend money for a change. Directing some of that money for institutional building at the think tank level, at the academic level, not one-year projects, but multi-year long-term projects, can use the TPP as a vehicle to enhance cooperation. If you think about doing the work as a goal in and of itself, as opposed to simply just the agreement being a success or failure, it's doing the work that is a success here.
Great comment. Thanks. Meredith?
I'm going to comment on, I'm kind of mashing together a couple of questions into something that wasn't quite asked, so sorry. When I think about the comment, we can't replace China with Taiwan. No, we can't. But it strikes a bit of a nerve of something that we discussed at lunch, and I think is a real problem Canada has. 75% of our exports go to the United States. That has only increased over time despite our trade diversification efforts. This is not going to change. Something called the gravity model of trade. It says that you mostly trade with countries that have very large GDPs that are really close to you. What is the country with really large GDP that's really close to us? The United States. So, as Canadians, we should stop kicking ourselves that we mostly trade with the United States. There's a whole bunch of reasons that we do, and we should keep doing that. diversifying to trade with others is hard. Linguistically, regulations, the list goes on, the distance, and so on. I think, though, the days, and so when Canada has thought about trade diversification, we have sought to replace trade with the United States with some other big country. It was China for a while, then we thought maybe it could be India. The reality is that that idea is not a realistic one, and those days are over. There's a bunch of smaller countries that we should get better at trading with. It requires sophistication. It requires companies to do research and want to trade and to be ready to trade. But we know from the research evidence, the first country in which a company is likely to trade with is the United States, and any trade diversification beyond that is additional to the United States. We don't trade with Taiwan or with Indonesia or with any other country in the Indo-Pacific as a first point of trade. We first learn how to trade with the United States, and then that company says, maybe I'm ready to diversify further. And so I guess it's a long way of saying that I think we need to abandon the idea that there is just a great shiny prize for Canada to get on the other side of the ocean that's going to solve our trade diversification challenges with the United States. It's not going to happen. And we have to kind of grow up, get sophisticated, and get on with it.
Amen.
That's a great closure. Please join me in thanking the members of the panel for a great panel. We're taking a break until 2:45 when panel 3 will start. Thank you.